Hello everyone, this is Bob and Threadbare, and welcome back to Weaving Worlds. For today's topic, I'm going to take a look at the world that surrounds your setting quite literally, because I want you to be aware of how geography can affect your story. Depending on where a story takes place, geography can force situations to happen, or it can hinder the things that the protagonists or the antagonists want to do, or it can even be the antagonist in a person versus nature conflict. There are a lot of things you can do with geography, whether it's fantastic, alien, or completely real, so try to be aware of the possibilities and the implications as you develop your setting. The world is always bigger. The tallest building ever made by humans is, at least as of this recording, the Burj Khalifa in Dubai at 2,716 feet, or 828 meters. The highest point on Earth is the top of Mount Everest, which rises 29,029 feet, or 8,848 meters. The biggest nuclear bomb ever exploded was the Tsar Bomba, with a yield of roughly 50 megatons of TNT. When the Tambora volcano exploded in 1815, it produced an estimated 33 gigatons of TNT in energy, and it killed 70,000 people directly, and then hundreds of thousands more thanks to famines and starvations triggered by overnight global cooling as the ash from Tambora blocked out the sun. And that's just the biggest volcano in recorded history. Previous eruptions have at times triggered mass extinction events. The point I'm making is that while the stakes of your story will be important to the people who take part in them, and maybe your epic story is also important to thousands or millions or billions of other people, the one thing it doesn't matter to is the world, or the galaxy that creates the backdrop for your setting. The great evil consuming the landscape does not actually remove the landscape from existence. Empires that wipe out nations and cultures from existence don't wipe out the land they lived on. And no matter what else happens, the sky is always going to be there overhead. The world is always bigger. Now, with that being said, it is possible to use speculative fiction to raise the stakes to a geological scale. Star Wars and the Hitchhiker's Guide series both blow up planets regularly, and fantasy villains could have godlike powers that allow them to completely ruin planets or else build mountain ranges to wall off their territory. So, thanks to speculative fiction, you can introduce planet-shattering stakes to your setting, but that still doesn't override my point, because the world is still always bigger. Instead, let this fact inspire you to think of ways that the heroes could match a villain with earth-shattering power, or else ways for heroes to evade villains with powers on that scale. And if a villain can merely mind control whole nations to do their bidding, then maybe the heroes can find a way to control the landscape itself, because the world is always bigger. Connecting dots. When you're trying to go from point A to point B, a straight line is very rarely the fastest and easiest path. Roads and trails usually have to navigate around rivers, forests, hills, mountains, valleys, lakes, oceans, and other obstacles that make a straight line either impossible or impractical. You also have to deal with different modes of transportation, such as horses, carts, carriages, wagons, railroads, automobiles, trucks, barges, sailboats, motorboats, airboats, spaceships, and starships. Each transportation form has its own set of advantages and limitations, and depending on your setting, a character may have to use several forms to get where they want to go. In some stories, characters will end up where they need to be without any trouble and without any explanation for how they got there. In other stories, the journey is the whole point, and we watch the characters struggle with all sorts of issues like vertical mountain slopes, airport delays, worn-out horses, and spaceships that malfunction on the way to the moon. Both types of story are equally valid, but sometimes authors will default to the first type of story because they forget that getting where you want to go can be twice as hard as what you need to do once you get there. The other way you can use transportation is when you create maps or come up with towns and cities for your setting. A city high in the mountains is unlikely to have any big river connections, but it will build some paved switchback roads so that traders and armies can come and go. A city by the ocean will need to have some source of fresh water, so they're most likely to sit next to river mouths or lakes. A town built along the only mountain pass for hundreds of miles will be wealthy thanks to all the trade that moves through, and if two towns appear to be close together on the map, they might turn out to be miles apart in travel distance thanks to a big canyon or river rapids that separate them. Geography and culture. When an area is easy to travel through, the different population centers in the area are free to mingle and create a common culture. When an area is hard to travel through, population centers will develop in their own directions and eventually have very little in common with each other. Now, it's worth mentioning that travel can become easy or hard because of the way national borders move and whether countries are at peace or at war, but then political geography is also a kind of geography. For that matter, pre-existing similarities and differences between cultures and religions can cause war and cause national boundaries to shift. Still, where those borders end up usually has something to do with natural barriers like mountain ranges, rivers, and oceans. Space travel and interstellar borders can also make use of natural barriers, depending on how faster-than-light travel works in your setting. If ships can jump between any 2 points in an instant, then there's really no such thing as near stars and far stars. And so each interstellar empire might own hundreds of different star systems scattered throughout the whole galaxy and overlapping each other. If you have to move through space to visit new stars, then you can create galactic hazards like empty areas with no star systems and no fuel for the engine, nebulae that obscure navigation, or uncharted black holes that might screw up your heading. You can also create a hyperspace node system that connects some star systems but not others, and thus create a galaxy with very limited movement. Planetary Diversity. Speaking of interstellar settings, one thing I've noticed a lot of settings do is have planetary monocultures, where everyone on a planet shares a language and a general culture, and every planet either has exactly one climate or one location on a planet, which is used to represent the whole thing. Now, of course, there is a reason for that. Speculative fiction authors are, at least so far, all from Earth, and can only use Earth to understand cultural and geographical distinctions. So when the hero of a space opera travels to 3 planets over the course of the plot, the author will create analogies by using 3 locations on Earth, such as tundra, a swamp, and a canyon. That makes it easy for the author to understand that these locations are distinct, and that makes it easy for the audience to understand. However, there's a lot you can do when you have a whole planet at your disposal. A planet that can support human life is likely to have just as much climate diversity as Earth, and so an author can use this diversity to create a whole exotic story that takes place on a single alien world. Likewise, millions or billions of inhabitants aren't likely to be completely culturally identical even if they live under a single planetary government. Just look at places like the United States, where people have all kinds of regional identities. Or France, where Normans, Bretons, and Savoy each have their own unique versions of French culture. Now, aside from the ease of understanding, another reason why authors stick with one location and one climate per planet is because when you spend time developing the cultures and climates of a single planet, you take away time that you could be spending on hopping between planets and making the scale of the story seem bigger. But keep in mind that we're building a setting here and not just a single story. By developing a planet's geography, you can create a story that wanders all across one planet and encounters all kinds of different regions and cultures, and then also have another story in your setting that follows the usual planet-hopping space opera formula. Planetary Diversity gives you the freedom to use one setting to tell a variety of story styles. The urban environment. What's true about planets and nations is also true about large cities. Cities have rich areas and poor areas. They have safe areas and dangerous areas. And depending on where they are, they can even have different microclimates in different neighborhoods. The movie The Warriors is a great representation of this, since the titular warriors have to fight their way through the gangs of New York to reach their home turf in Coney Island. And along the way they encounter a variety of colorful gangs from different ethnic backgrounds, and several distinct architectural styles that visually demonstrate their progress. What this means is that you can use geography to tell a story even if that story never leaves the city limits. The different street connections, subcultures, neighborhoods, and boroughs can do the same jobs as the national borders, mountain ranges, and rivers of a larger scale work. Geography can always be a part of your story no matter how big or small it happens to be. Geography as an emphasis. Geography has been used as a way to emphasize plot points for centuries, or even millennia. The evil sorcerer lives in a dark castle surrounded by thorns or barren wastes. The good king's lands are always sunny and get just the right amount of rain every year. And when the princess dies, the land itself mourns her passing with a week of perpetual rain. When you build a fictional world instead of using Earth, you can use the geography of your setting to emphasize the plot or the themes that you want to tell without having to worry about any random factors that could distract from the point. For instance, in The Left Hand of Darkness, the protagonist and his friend spend most of the third act trying to cross a glacier to escape a totalitarian regime. The reason the glacier is there and needs to be crossed is because the author, Ursula K. Le Guin, is making the point that gender norms are a construct, and when it's us against nature, we're all just humans. So, whether geography is in the background or the foreground, you can use it to underline your story. Geography as an obstacle. When you make geography matter to your story, chances are it'll get in the way somehow when your protagonists want to do something. What this means is that geography can become part of the challenge that the antagonists use against the protagonists, and it could be something as simple as the fact that the antagonists are closer to their goal than the protagonists. Or maybe the opposite is true, and the reason the protagonists have a fighting chance is because the antagonists have to get past some geography that's in their way. For a practical example of this, consider the Battle of Yavin 4 at the end of Star Wars: A New Hope. The only reason the rebels have a chance to destroy the Death Star before it blows up their base is because the Death Star needs to move around a gas giant to get a clear shot. The geography of the star system is slowing down the Empire and explaining why they don't just blow up the rebel base the moment they arrive. For another example, consider the Swamp of Sadness from the Neverending Story. Atreyu needs to cross the swamp to find an ancient sage, but the depression coming up from the swamp slows him down and claims his horse, Artax. Atreyu eventually gets where he's going, but the landscape itself almost stopped his journey. Geography as the conflict. Person versus nature is one of the four main conflicts that a story can use. The world around us can be so hazardous that we can write gripping stories in which no one is the villain, society isn't at fault, and the main character doesn't even have any inner demons that they need to overcome to be a better person. Instead, the main struggle is against the terrible cold of a glacier, the unendurable heat of a desert, the dangerous parasites of a jungle, the endless vacuum of space, or the deadly spread of a disease. You can tap into these kinds of stories by creating areas in your setting where the situation is so hazardous to human or other intelligent life that surviving it can be a story all on its own. You can then make person versus nature conflicts the heart of your story, or you can add it to a bigger story like The Left Hand of Darkness, or Frank Herbert's Dune. Geography can be important regardless of the kinds of stories you want to write. Whether your setting includes Earth, a fictional planet, or a whole galaxy of star systems, you can use geography to link cultures, to emphasize your themes, to create hazards, or even to be the center of the whole story. The possibilities are limitless. Thanks for joining me again for today's journey into Weaving Worlds. Please like, share, and subscribe because that raises my visibility here on YouTube. Check out my other stuff if you have some time, support me on Patreon if you have some money, and I hope I'll see you again for the next video.